12,000 years ago, the last time a particular mountain in Ethiopia was awake, human beings were still hunting woolly mammoths, and the last ice age had not yet ended. On the 23rd of November last year, that mountain erupted, and it is not alone. Over the last 12 months, 3 separate volcanoes on 3 separate continents, each silent for spans of time that range from all of recorded human history to 12,000 years to roughly 5 centuries, have each shown the unmistakable signs of coming back to life. 3 sleeping giants stirring inside a single year, and the question that puts a cold weight in your stomach is the obvious one. Is the planet itself waking up? Tonight we're going to take that question seriously, follow it all the way down, and find an answer that is stranger, and in some ways more unsettling, than the fear itself. But first, a quick note before we get into it. If you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The Whisper from 12 miles down. There is a mountain on the Alaska Peninsula that has never, in the entire span of recorded human memory, done anything at all. Not in the written record, not in the oral histories of the people who have lived along that coastline for thousands of years, not in any geological survey, any expedition log, any scientific catalogue. For as long as human beings have been watching that part of the world, Mount Cupranov has simply stood there, a heavily glaciated peak wrapped in ice and silence, classified by the people whose job it is to classify such things with a single, almost dismissive word: unassigned. That is the technical term for a volcano that nobody is watching, because nobody has ever had a reason to watch it. And then, a few months ago, that mountain started to whisper. I want you to understand what that word means here, because it is not a metaphor I am reaching for to sound dramatic. When scientists talk about a volcano whispering, they are describing something very specific and very real. They are describing a particular kind of earthquake, a low-frequency tremor that does not come from rock grinding against rock the way an ordinary earthquake does. It comes from fluid. It comes from something moving through the deep plumbing of a mountain, something that should not be there, pushing and flexing the rock around it as it rises. And in February of this year, instruments picked up exactly that signal coming from underneath Mount Cupranov. Low-frequency earthquakes, originating from a depth of roughly 12 miles beneath the surface, 12 miles down in the dark in a volcano that the entire human species had written off as dead. Something began to move. Here is the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind already, and it is the question this entire video is built around. If a volcano has been silent for all of recorded history, and then it starts to stir, how would we even know? What does it actually take to catch a sleeping giant in the act of waking up? Because Cupranov is not the only one. Over the last 12 months, 3 separate volcanoes, on 3 separate continents, each of them silent for a span of time that ranges from all of human history to 12,000 years to roughly 5 centuries, have each shown the unmistakable signs of coming back to life. 3 giants, 3 different timescales of sleep. And the temptation, the very natural and very human temptation, is to look at those 3 events stacked up inside a single year and feel something cold settle in your stomach. To feel like the planet itself is changing, like something is ramping up. That feeling has a root in the way our minds are built. We are pattern-detecting creatures shaped by evolution, because for most of human history, the person who spotted the pattern in the rustling grass, the one that meant a predator, lived longer than the person who did not. Pattern detection kept our ancestors alive, but that same instinct turned loose on a handful of dramatic events in the news will reliably manufacture a pattern whether or not a real one is there. It is not a flaw you can simply switch off by being clever. It runs underneath thought itself, which means the only honest defense against being misled by it is the slow, deliberate work of investigation, the work of actually going and checking, mechanism by mechanism, whether the pattern your gut insists upon is genuinely present in the evidence. That checking is what the rest of tonight is for. That feeling is what we're going to investigate tonight. Not dismiss. Investigate. Because the honest answer to what is happening is stranger, and in some ways more unsettling, than the simple story of a planet waking up. And it starts with that whisper from 12 miles down, underneath a mountain in Alaska that nobody was watching. I want to set the terms of this investigation clearly, before we go any further, because how we ask the question determines what kind of answer we are allowed to find. The lazy version of this story, the version you will find in 100 breathless places online, simply lines up the eruptions, points at them, and lets the fear do the rest. That is not what we're going to do. We're going to take each of these 3 sleeping giants in turn, and for each one we're going to ask a single demanding question. Not did it erupt, because we already know it did. The question is how? By what specific physical process did this particular mountain come back to life? Because here is the principle that will carry us all the way through tonight. If these 3 events truly are part of one great connected phenomenon, then they should share a mechanism. They should wake up the same way, or in related ways, driven by some common cause. And if they do not, if each one turns out to have woken for its own separate and unrelated reason, then the connected story collapses, no matter how alarming the 3 of them look stacked together in a single paragraph. Mechanism is the test, so let us apply it rigorously, starting with that whisper from 12 miles down. Let me walk you through what happened to Cupranov, because the sequence matters. It is a kind of awakening in stages, and each stage tells you something. It began, as I said, in February. Low-frequency seismic activity, the fluid signal detected beneath the volcano. On its own, that is interesting but not alarming. Volcanic systems can murmur in the deep for years and never do anything more. But then the second stage arrived, and it arrived in a way that genuinely got the attention of the people at the Alaska Volcano Observatory. In late April, an earthquake. A real one, a magnitude 3.1 directly beneath the mountain. Now, a magnitude 3.1 earthquake is, by most measures, small. If one happened beneath your city, you might not even feel it. So why did this particular 3.1 make volcanologists sit up straight? The answer is one of the most important facts in this entire story, and I need you to hold on to it, because we're going to come back to it again and again. The reason that magnitude 3.1 mattered so much is that there is no seismic monitoring network at Mount Cupranov. None. Not a single instrument planted on the mountain itself. The nearest seismometer capable of detecting that earthquake was roughly 27 kilometers away. And earthquakes, like sound, fade with distance. The further you are from the source, the smaller an earthquake has to be before it slips beneath the threshold of detection entirely. So think about what that means. A station 27 kilometers away registered a magnitude 3.1. But everything smaller than that, everything happening closer to the threshold, every minor tremor and microquake that a properly instrumented volcano would have recorded by the hundreds, all of that was simply invisible. The unsettling implication, and the scientists were explicit about this, is that the mountain may well have been producing far more activity than anyone could see. We were not hearing the volcano. We were hearing the loudest fraction of the volcano, the part loud enough to shout across 27 kilometers of Alaskan wilderness. The rest of it, the whisper underneath the shout, was lost. And then came the 3rd stage, and the 3rd stage is the one that changes a curiosity into a genuine concern. Gas. Beginning on the 4th of April, satellites detected sulfur dioxide rising from Mount Cupranov. Sulfur dioxide is one of the clearest fingerprints of magma there is. When molten rock rises toward the surface, the pressure on it drops, and dissolved gases begin to come out of it the same way bubbles come out of a soda bottle the moment you twist the cap. Sulfur dioxide is one of those gases, and the numbers were not subtle. The background rate for this mountain, the amount of sulfur dioxide you would expect from a dead volcano just sitting there, is less than 100 tons per day. What the satellites measured was somewhere between 100 and 1,000 tons per day. The mountain was not just whispering anymore, it was breathing. I want you to appreciate why that gas signal is so much more telling than the earthquakes alone. Earthquakes by themselves are ambiguous. The ground can shake for many reasons, and a volcano can produce seismic activity and then fall quiet again without anything dramatic ever happening. But sulfur dioxide in those quantities is much harder to explain away. That gas was dissolved in magma. For it to be escaping into the atmosphere above Cupranov, magma had to be present, and it had to be close enough to the surface and under low enough pressure for the gas to bubble out of it. The gas is not a hint that something might be happening. The gas is direct evidence that molten rock is there. When the seismic whisper and the sulfur dioxide were put side by side, the picture stopped being ambiguous. Something was rising into Mount Cupranov, and it was rising far enough that the mountain had begun to exhale. By the 12th of May, the Alaska Volcano Observatory had seen enough. They took Mount Cupranov, a volcano that had carried the label unassigned through the entire span of human observation, and they raised it. Aviation Color Code Yellow. Volcano Alert Level Advisory. For the first time in recorded history, that mountain was on a watch list. And the official assessment of why was careful and precise, and I am going to quote the substance of it directly because the precision matters. The unrest, they said, is likely caused by a magmatic intrusion beneath the volcano. Magma, in other words, is rising into it. But here is the part that the careful viewer needs to hold on to, the part that separates this channel from the places that would simply scream the word eruption at you and move on. The Alaska Volcano Observatory also said, clearly and deliberately, that the data do not suggest an eruption is imminent. They said that further signs of increasing unrest would be expected before any eruption. There is no lava here, there is no ash, there is no eruption. There is a mountain that was dead and is now, by every measurable sign, alive again, and a group of scientists watching it very, very carefully. That is the story. A watch, not a catastrophe. So that is the first of our 3 sleeping giants, and already it has handed us the central mystery of this video on a plate. A volcano woke up. We caught it. But we very nearly did not because there was almost nothing out there listening. And if that is true for one mountain on the Alaska Peninsula, then the question becomes almost unbearable in its implications. How many others are stirring right now, in the dark, in the silence, with no instrument close enough to hear the whisper? Hold that thought. Because the next giant slept for 12,000 years, and the story of how it woke up rewrites what the word waking even means. Part 2. A mountain that slept through the Ice Age. To understand the second of our 3 giants, I need you to do something with your sense of time. I need you to stretch it. Mount Cupranov was silent through recorded human history, and that is a long silence, thousands of years deep. But the volcano we are about to discuss makes that silence look like a held breath. This one slept through the entire Holocene, and to grasp what that means, you have to picture the last time it was awake. The last time this mountain is believed to have erupted, the most recent ice age was ending. Glaciers that had buried much of the northern world for tens of thousands of years were beginning their long retreat. The human beings alive at that time were hunting animals that no longer exist. Woolly mammoths still walked the earth. There were no cities, no writing, no agriculture, no wheel. Everything we think of as human civilization, every pyramid and empire and cathedral and skyscraper, every word ever written down, all of it was still in the future. All of it would unfold during the long sleep of this single mountain. That is 12,000 years. That is the dormancy of Hayli Gubbi, a volcano in the Afar region of northeastern Ethiopia. And on the 23rd of November last year it woke up. Hayli Gubbi sits in one of the most geologically violent places on the surface of the planet, and that is not an exaggeration. It lies at the southern end of a volcanic chain called the erupted Range, inside the East African Rift. The East African Rift is a place where the continent of Africa is, very slowly and very literally, tearing itself in two. The crust there is being pulled apart, stretched and thinned, and where crust thins, magma finds it easier to rise. It is one of the most active rift systems anywhere on Earth, and yet surrounded by all of that activity, Hayli Gubbi itself had done nothing for 12,000 years. It was, in geological terms, a dead spot in a living landscape. I want to spend a moment on the Afar region itself, because the setting is not just background scenery here, it is the reason the whole event was possible. The Afar Depression, in the far northeast of Ethiopia, is one of the lowest, hottest, and most inhospitable landscapes anywhere on the planet. Parts of it lie below sea level. The ground in places is a crust of salt. Daytime temperatures are punishing, and it is geologically extraordinary because it is one of the very few places on Earth where you can stand on dry land and watch the process of an ocean being born. The Afar Depression is where 3 pieces of the Earth's crust are pulling away from one another, and over millions of years, as they continue to separate, the ocean will eventually flood in, and the Horn of Africa will become an island. Right now, today, that process is mid-stride. The crust there is being stretched so thin, and is so riddled with the rising heat of the mantle beneath, that magma is unusually close to the surface across the whole region. Afar is not a place with a volcano in it. Afar is a place that is, in a sense, becoming volcanic in its entirety. That matters for our story because it tells you something about the plumbing. In a setting like the Afar, the magma is not neatly bottled up in isolated chambers, one per mountain, each sealed off from its neighbours. The crust is shot through with magma, with sills and dikes and pockets and conduits, a connected and dynamic system that does not respect the tidy idea of one volcano, one magma supply. And once you understand that, the idea that magma from one volcano could travel underground and reactivate another stops sounding exotic and starts sounding almost expected. In the Afar, the volcanoes are not strangers to one another. They share a neighbourhood, and the neighbourhood is plumbed. So when it erupted, explosively, on that November day, the obvious question was the same one we asked about Cupranov. Why now? What woke it? And the answer, when scientists pieced it together, turned out to be one of the most remarkable things in this entire story, because it forces us to completely rethink what it means for a volcano to wake up. Hayli Gubbi did not, in the way you are probably imagining, wake up on its own. It did not slowly build its own pressure, fill its own chamber, and finally burst on its own internal schedule. Something else happened, something stranger. Hayli Gubbi was, for lack of a better phrase, plumbed in from the side. Here is how it unfolded. To the north of Hayli Gubbi sits another volcano, and this one is the opposite of dormant. It is called erupted, and it is one of the most persistently active volcanoes on the entire planet. Erupted is famous among volcanologists for hosting a long-lived lava lake, an open, churning pool of molten rock that has been visible at its summit for much of the last century. Erupted is never really asleep, and in July of last year Erupted did something dramatic. Beginning around the 10th of July, a dike intrusion began in the Erupted system. I need to explain what a dike is, because it is the key to this entire chapter. A dike, in volcanic terms, is a sheet of magma, a near vertical blade of molten rock, that forces its way through the crust by cracking the rock ahead of it. It does not rise straight up in a neat column, it can travel. It can propagate sideways, underground, sometimes for enormous distances, following the lines of weakness in the crust like water, finding the cracks in a pavement. Picture it this way. Imagine you're trying to force a thin wedge into a block of wood. The wedge does not melt the wood ahead of it. It splits it, cracking the fibres apart and driving forward into the gap it has just created. A dike does something similar, except the wedge is made of molten rock under tremendous pressure, and the block it is splitting is the crust of the earth. The magma pushes into a crack, the pressure forces the crack to extend, and the magma flows into the newly opened space, and then the process repeats over and over, the crack racing ahead and the magma chasing it. In a place like the Afar, where the crust is already being stretched and is already laced with weakness, a dike can travel astonishing distances this way, moving horizontally through the subsurface, kilometre after kilometre, while on the surface above there may be almost nothing to see, but, at most, a faint flexing of the ground. And that is the crucial, almost eerie quality of a propagating dike. It is one of the most dramatic events the crust of the earth can produce, a literal river of magma carving its way through solid rock, and yet it can be nearly invisible from the surface. There is no mountain of fire marking its path. There is no glowing crack across the desert. There is just, if you have the right instrument, a subtle change in the shape of the ground, which means that for almost all of human history, a dike intrusion like the one we are about to follow would have happened completely unwitnessed. The magma would have moved, the dormant volcano would have been plumbed in, and not a single human being would have known any of it was happening. Hold that thought, because it is going to matter enormously later. And on the 15th of July, as this dike was developing, Erupted itself underwent a major eruption, with caldera collapse and explosive ejection of ash and gas. That was the visible event. But the invisible event, the one that mattered for Hayli Gubbi, was happening underground. Because that dike, that blade of magma, did not stop at Erupted. Over roughly the next 25 days, satellites tracked it propagating southward, underground, beneath the desert. And the way they tracked it is itself a crucial part of tonight's story. So mark it now, and we will return to it in depth later. They used a technology called INSAR, which stands for Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Radar. In the simplest possible terms, it is a way of using radar from satellites in orbit to measure the shape of the ground with astonishing precision, precise enough to detect the surface of the desert, bulging or sagging by mere centimeters as magma moves beneath it. INSAR lets scientists watch a river of magma flow underground in something close to real time, without a single instrument on the ground above it. And what they watched was extraordinary. Over those 25 days, the dike propagated about 36 kilometers to the south. 36 kilometers. It intruded an estimated 4/10 of a cubic kilometer of magma into the crust, and its path, its southward underground path, ran directly beneath Hayli Gubbi, the dead volcano, the one that had slept for 12,000 years. Magma from an active neighbour travelled the better part of 40 kilometres underground and passed directly beneath a mountain that had been silent since the Ice Age. By late July, Hayli Gubbi began to show low-level signs of life. The first of them was, once again, sulfur dioxide, the same gas signature we saw at Cupranov, the fingerprint of magma near the surface. Think about that repetition for a moment, because it is not a coincidence of storytelling. It is a coincidence of physics. Two volcanoes, on two different continents, woken by two completely different mechanisms, and yet both of them announced their awakening with the same chemical signal. That is because the signal is not about the mechanism. It is about the magma. Whenever molten rock rises close enough to the surface, the pressure on it falls, and the gases dissolved within it begin to escape, and sulfur dioxide is among the first and clearest of them. It does not matter whether the magma rose from directly below, as at Cupranov, or arrived from the side, as at Hayli Gubbi. Once it is near the surface, it breathes, and the breath smells of sulfur, and a satellite overhead can catch it. The gas is a kind of universal language that waking volcanoes speak, and we have recently learned to read it. And then, on the 23rd of November, it happened. Hayli Gubbi erupted, explosively. For the first time in the entire Holocene, the first time in roughly 12,000 years, that mountain threw itself open. Ash columns climbed to altitudes reported as high as 14 kilometers, with some observations putting the top of the plume near 45,000 feet. And that ash did not stay in Ethiopia. It rode the high-altitude winds out across the Red Sea, over Yemen, and onward toward India, Pakistan, and China. A volcano that had been dead since humans were hunting mammoths reached up and touched the airspace of 3 nations on another continent. Consider the human scale of that. The communities living in the shadow of Hayli Gubbi had no cultural memory of it as a volcano at all. How could they? 12,000 years is far longer than any oral tradition, any story passed down from grandparent to grandchild can possibly span. To the people of that region, Hayli Gubbi was simply a feature of the landscape, a hill among hills, as permanent and as harmless as the ground itself. There was no folklore warning that it might one day wake. There was no living memory, no inherited caution, nothing. And then one day in November it became, without any warning rooted in human experience, an erupting volcano throwing ash 45,000 feet into the sky. Fortunately, and this matters, there were no fatalities reported from the eruption itself, but the livelihoods of people in the region, particularly livestock herders whose animals depend on grazing land that ash can ruin, were genuinely threatened. A 12,000-year silence does not just mean a long scientific dormancy. It means a volcano can return to a community that has, completely understandably, forgotten it was ever a volcano at all. Now sit with what the mechanism here actually means, because it is genuinely profound. We tend to imagine a dormant volcano as a thing with an internal clock, slowly counting down to its own eruption on its own schedule. But Hayli Gubbi shows us that this picture can be completely wrong. A volcano can be silent for 12,000 years, and then be reactivated, not by anything happening inside itself, but by a decision made by a neighbour 40 kilometres away. Hayli Gubbi did not wake up. It was woken. It was reached, underground, by magma that belonged to a different mountain entirely, and when researchers later modelled the whole event using INSAR time series data, they found the system was even more complex than that, fed by multiple magma bodies, including shallow pockets only about a kilometre down and a deeper source around 7 kilometres down. So now we have two giants and two completely different stories. Cupranov is being woken from below, by magma rising into it. Hayli Gubbi was woken from the side, by magma migrating into it from elsewhere. Same outcome, a sleeping volcano coming back to life, but two utterly different causes. Already the simple story, The story where the planet is just generally waking up is starting to fall apart in our hands. Because if these two events had a single shared cause, they would not look this different. Hold that, because the third giant is different again. It slept for 500 years, and it was woken by one of the most violent events this planet is capable of producing. Part 3. 600 years, then the 6th largest earthquake ever recorded. The third of our sleeping giants is a volcano called Krasheninnikov, and it sits on the Kamchatka Peninsula, that long, dramatic spike of land in the Russian Far East that hangs down toward Japan like an icicle made of fire. Kamchatka is one of the most volcanically dense places on Earth. It is a landscape of cones and calderas, dozens upon dozens of volcanoes packed along the spine of the peninsula, fed by the Pacific Plate diving down beneath it. And among all of those mountains, Krasheninnikov had been one of the quiet ones. According to the Smithsonian Institution's Global Volcanism Program, the most authoritative catalogue of eruptions on the planet, Krasheninnikov's last confirmed eruption was around the year 1550. Let me put 1550 in human terms, because the number on its own is just a number. Roughly 475 years ago, when Krasheninnikov last erupted, the European voyages to the Americas were still raw and recent history, and permanent settlement of those continents by Europeans had barely begun. The Aztec Empire had only just fallen. Shakespeare would not be born for more than a decade. That is the depth of this volcano's sleep. Not 12,000 years like Hayli Gubbi, but 5 centuries, which is still long enough that no living person, no person's grandparent, no person's grandparent's grandparent, had ever seen it do anything at all, and then, last summer it woke up. But to understand how it woke up, we cannot start with the volcano. We have to start with the earthquake, on the 29th of July last year, which was already the 30th of July in local Kamchatka time. The seafloor off the coast of the peninsula ruptured, and it did not rupture in a small way. The earthquake that resulted was a magnitude 8.8. I want to make sure that number lands properly, because the magnitude scale is not intuitive. It is not linear. Each step up the scale represents a vast multiplication of energy. A magnitude 8.8 is not a little bigger than a magnitude 7. It is releasing energy on a scale that dwarfs it many times over. A magnitude 8.8 earthquake ties as the 6th largest earthquake ever recorded by modern seismic instruments. The 6th largest. Out of every earthquake humanity has measured since we built the tools to measure them. This was one of the genuinely great earthquakes of the instrumental era. And it did not come without warning, though warning is a complicated word when it comes to earthquakes. For about 10 days beforehand, the seafloor off Kamchatka had been restless. There was a foreshock sequence, a run of earthquakes that in retrospect were the prelude. Roughly 50 of them were magnitude 5 or larger. One of them, on the 20th of July, was a magnitude 7.4, which is itself a major earthquake, the kind that on any ordinary week would be the headline. 3 of them were magnitude 6.6. All of that violence turned out to be the overture. The main event, the magnitude 8.8, struck on the megathrust, the great fault where the Pacific Plate grinds down and under the plate that Kamchatka rides on. I want to make sure the word megathrust lands with its full weight, because it is the most powerful kind of fault on the planet, and it is the engine behind both the earthquake and, indirectly, the volcanoes. A megathrust is the boundary along which one tectonic plate dives beneath another, a process called subduction. Off the coast of Kamchatka, the vast Pacific Plate is sliding down and under, descending into the hot interior of the Earth at a rate of several centimetres a year. That descent does not happen smoothly. The two plates lock together along the contact, friction holding them fast, while the slow, relentless motion of the planet keeps trying to push them past each other. Stress builds and builds and builds, sometimes for centuries, until the lock finally fails and the accumulated strain releases all at once. When a megathrust fails, it is capable of producing the largest earthquakes the Earth can generate. Every earthquake in recorded history above about magnitude 9 has been a megathrust earthquake. The magnitude 8.8 off Kamchatka was the megathrust doing exactly what it does, on the grand scale. And the same subduction that builds the megathrust also builds the volcanoes. This is the deep connection at the heart of Kamchatka, and it is worth understanding. As the Pacific Plate descends beneath Kamchatka, it carries water down with it, locked into the minerals of the oceanic crust. As that slab sinks deeper and gets hotter, the water is driven out and it rises into the wedge of mantle above the descending plate. Water has a remarkable effect on hot rock. It lowers its melting point. So the water released from the sinking slab causes the mantle above it to begin to melt, and that melt is the magma that rises to feed the volcanoes of Kamchatka. This is why Kamchatka is studded with dozens of volcanoes in the first place. They are all ultimately products of the same subduction that produces the megathrust earthquakes. The earthquakes and the volcanoes are siblings, both children of the same descending plate, which is precisely why it is not absurd to ask whether one sibling, the magnitude 8.8 earthquake, might have disturbed the other. 4 days later, Krasheninnikov erupted. 4 days. On the 3rd of August, a volcano that had been silent since around 1550 produced a major eruption, a plume of ash climbing roughly 6 kilometers into the sky. The Smithsonian's Global Volcanism program characterized it plainly as the volcano's first eruption since around 1550. After 475 years of silence, 4 days after the 6th largest earthquake ever recorded struck 140 miles away, the mountain came back to life. Now the human mind is a pattern-finding machine, and when you hear a sequence like that, a colossal earthquake followed 4 days later by the awakening of an ancient volcano, your mind does something automatic. It draws a line between the two. It says, of course, the earthquake did it. And I want to be very careful here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where this channel has to do its real work. The honest answer is not a simple yes, and it is not a simple no. The honest answer is a hypothesis, and a fascinating one, and it needs to be stated precisely. Here is what we can say. Large earthquakes are documented in the scientific literature to sometimes be followed by increased volcanic activity in the surrounding region. This is a real phenomenon. It is sometimes called triggered volcanism, and there are several proposed mechanisms for how it works. One is dynamic stress. The seismic waves from a great earthquake do not just shake buildings, they roll through the crust, and as they pass through a magma reservoir they can physically shake it, jostle it, disturb the delicate equilibrium of molten rock and dissolved gas. Another mechanism is static stress change. A great earthquake permanently rearranges the stresses in the crust around it, and that rearrangement can change the pressure squeezing on a magma chamber, sometimes effectively giving the magma a path or a push. A third mechanism involves gas bubbles. Shaking magma can cause dissolved gases to come out of solution and form bubbles, and bubbles make magma more buoyant, more eager to rise. Think of shaking a bottle of soda before you open it. So the earthquake to volcano connection is real. But, and this is the critical qualifier, it does not happen to every volcano near every great earthquake. If it did, every one of Kamchatka's dozens of volcanoes would have erupted on the 3rd of August, and they did not. Triggered volcanism appears to require a volcano that is already primed, already close, already in its own slow way progressing toward an eruption. The earthquake in this picture is not the cause of the eruption in the way a match is the cause of a fire. It is more like an accelerant. The fuel was already there, the system was already loaded, the earthquake simply pulled the process forward, compressed a timeline that might otherwise have taken months or years into a span of 4 days. Let me give you an analogy that I think captures it well. Imagine a long row of mousetraps, each one set, each one with its spring under tension, waiting. Now imagine you slam a door at one end of the room, the vibration travels through the floor. Most of the mousetraps, the ones that are well set and stable, do nothing at all. The vibration is not enough to disturb them, but here and there, a mousetrap that was set just slightly too delicately, balanced right at the edge of its trigger point, snaps shut. The slammed door did not build those mousetraps, did not set them, did not put the tension in their springs. All of that was already done. The door simply delivered the final tiny nudge to the ones that were already on the very edge of going off. That is, as best we understand it, what a great earthquake does to a region of volcanoes. It does not create eruptions. It collects the ones that were already almost ready, and it triggers them, all at once, in a sudden cluster that can look, from the outside, like a coordinated awakening, but is really just the simultaneous tripping of a set of independently loaded triggers. This distinction is not a technicality. It is the difference between a true and a false understanding of what happened at Krasheninnikov. If you believe the earthquake caused the eruption, then you believe in a world where a volcano can be turned on like a switch, where dormancy means nothing, and any sleeping giant could be jolted awake at any moment by any sufficiently large quake. That is a frightening and importantly an inaccurate picture. The accurate picture is more reassuring and more interesting. Krasheninnikov was not a random dead volcano that an earthquake happened to resurrect. It was, in all likelihood, a volcano that had been slowly, quietly progressing toward an eruption for some time already, its own internal processes building toward a threshold. The earthquake found it in that primed state and pushed it the last small distance. Without the earthquake, Krasheninnikov very likely would still have erupted just later on its own schedule. The earthquake changed the timing, it did not write the outcome. And there is one more piece of evidence that makes the triggered volcanism reading at Kamchatka genuinely compelling. Beyond just Krasheninnikov, on the 6th of August, the Institute of Volcanology and Seismology of the Russian Academy of Sciences reported that 7 volcanoes on the Kamchatka Peninsula had shown eruptive activity associated with the earthquake. 7. And they noted that an occurrence like that many volcanoes responding in concert to a single seismic event, had not been seen on Kamchatka in nearly 300 years. That is not the kind of statistic you can easily wave away. 7 primed volcanic systems, all perturbed at once by the passage of one enormous earthquake. But here is where I have to be careful, and ask you to be careful with me, because there is a subtle trap even inside this compelling piece of evidence. 7 volcanoes responding to one earthquake sounds, on its face, like exactly the connected, synchronized awakening that the frightening version of this story wants. And in a narrow local sense, those 7 Kamchatkan volcanoes genuinely were connected by a single shared cause, the magnitude 8.8 earthquake. But notice what that connection actually was. It was not some mysterious planetary force. It was a specific, physical, well-understood event, an earthquake, acting on a specific geographically concentrated set of volcanoes, all of them sitting on the same peninsula above the same subduction zone, all of them within reach of the same seismic shaking. That is a real connection, but it is a local one. It is the slammed door tripping the nearby mousetraps. It tells you nothing at all, about whether a volcano in Alaska or a volcano in Ethiopia would be affected, because they were nowhere near that earthquake and felt nothing from it. So even Kamchatka, even the most connected-looking part of our whole story, when you examine it honestly, is a local phenomenon with a local cause. It is not evidence of a global awakening. It is evidence that one big earthquake can rattle the prime volcanoes in its own immediate neighborhood, which is a very different and much smaller claim. So now we have all 3 of our giants, and look at what we're holding. Cupranov, woken from below by a slow magmatic intrusion. Hayli Gubbi, woken from the side by a dike travelling underground from a neighbour. Krasheninnikov, woken, or at least accelerated, by the shock of one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded. 3 giants, 3 timescales of sleep, 3 completely separate and independent mechanisms, and that, right there, is the first crack in the frightening story. Because if you wanted to believe that the planet itself is generally waking up, that some single global cause is stirring all the world's volcanoes at once, then these 3 events are the worst possible evidence for you. They do not share a cause. They could not look more different in how they happened. Hold on to that tightly because we are going to build on it. But first, we need to deal with the fact that this is not just history, because as of right now, tonight, it is still happening. Part 4. It is still happening right now. Everything I have described to you so far has a date attached to it that is at least a few months in the past. Cuprianov's escalation unfolded across this spring. Hayli Gubbi erupted last November. Krasheninnikov woke last August. And it would be easy, hearing all of that, to file this away as a story about the recent past, a sequence of events that has already finished playing out. But I want to take that comfort away from you, gently, because it is not accurate. This is not a closed file. As I am recording this, the exact same processes are unfolding in real time at volcanoes around the Pacific Rim, and some of them are further along than others. Let me take you on a tour of right now, of the state of the world's restless volcanoes as of today. We will start back in Kamchatka, because Kamchatka is not done. There is a volcano there called Bezimiany, and Bezimiany has a long and violent history, but what matters for us tonight is its current state. Within the last couple of weeks, Bezimiany was raised to aviation colour code orange. Now, I have mentioned these aviation colour codes a few times, And before we go further, I want to make sure you understand the system, because it is the language scientists use to tell the world how worried to be, and reading it correctly is part of being a careful observer. The aviation colour code system has 4 levels. Green means a volcano is in its normal, non-eruptive state. Yellow, the level Cupranov now sits at, means a volcano is showing signs of elevated unrest above its known background. The whisper stage, the watch stage. Orange means a volcano is showing heightened unrest with an increased likelihood of eruption, or is in eruption with limited ash emission. And red, the top level, means a major eruption is imminent or underway with significant ash. The codes were designed with aviation specifically in mind, because ash is invisible to radar and lethal to jet engines, but they also serve as a clear, shared, international shorthand for a volcano state. So when I tell you Cupranov is at yellow and Bazimiani is at orange, I am telling you something precise. These 2 volcanoes are at different stages of the same journey, and Bazimiani is further along it. Orange means an eruption is underway or strongly suspected, with significant ash emission. Bazimiani earned that orange after an explosive eruption, with hot avalanches descending its flanks and an intensifying thermal anomaly, a growing hotspot visible from satellites in orbit. This is not a watch. This is a volcano in active eruption, right now. And Bazimiani matters for more than just itself, because of where it is. Kamchatka sits underneath some of the busiest aviation corridors on the planet, the great circle routes that connect North America and Asia. Volcanic ash and jet engines are a catastrophic combination. Ash is essentially powdered rock and glass, and when it is sucked into a jet engine it can melt, coat the internal components, and cause the engine to fail. So a volcano going to orange in Kamchatka is not only a geological event, it is an aviation hazard story, watched closely by the centres responsible for warning aircraft away from ash clouds. Now let us travel south and west, to the Philippines, because there is a volcano there that is, right now, doing something that should sound deeply familiar to you. The volcano is called Bulusan, and the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology has reported that since the 18th of May, Bulusan has logged 442 volcano-tectonic earthquakes. 442 in a matter of days, 55 of them at depths shallower than 5 kilometers. The Institute has classified this as new unrest. I want to slow down on that phrase, volcano-tectonic earthquake, because it is more meaningful than it might sound. A volcano-tectonic earthquake is an earthquake caused by rock fracturing in and around a volcano, and it is one of the clearest signs that something is forcing the rock to break. And what forces rock to break inside a volcano? Very often it is magma, or pressurized fluid pushing into spaces that were not there before, cracking the surrounding rock to make room for itself. So 442 volcano-tectonic earthquakes in a few days is not random noise. It is the sound of rock being broken repeatedly in great quantity, somewhere beneath Bulusan. And the detail that 55 of those events were shallower than 5 kilometers is significant too, because shallow earthquakes mean the rock breaking is happening closer to the surface, which is exactly what you would expect if pressurized material were working its way upward. Stop and connect that to the very first thing I told you tonight. Remember Cupranov and the whisper from 12 miles down. Remember how the entire crisis there began with seismic activity, with earthquakes beneath the mountains signaling that something was moving in the deep. What you are watching at Bulusan right now is that exact phase, that exact whisper, happening live. 442 earthquakes is a volcano talking. It is the early warning signature, the same category of signal that started the Cupranov story, and it is being recorded as we speak. The difference is that Bulusan, unlike Cupranov, is being watched closely by a well-equipped national monitoring agency, because the Philippines is a densely populated country that has learned, through hard and tragic experience, to take its volcanoes very seriously. And that difference, that contrast between Bulusan and Cupranov, is itself one of the most instructive things in this entire video, so let me draw it out. Here are 2 volcanoes, both in a state of unrest, both producing the seismic signature of something moving beneath them. One of them, Bulusan, sits in a densely populated nation with a long and painful volcanic history, and so it is wrapped in instruments, watched continuously, its every earthquake counted and catalogued in something close to real time. The other, Cupranov, sits in a remote and nearly empty corner of the Alaska Peninsula, and so its nearest seismometer is 27 kilometers away, and its awakening was very nearly missed. Same kind of event, wildly different levels of watching. The volcano did not choose how closely it would be observed. We chose through where we placed our instruments, and we placed them, understandably, where the people are. Bulusan and Cupranov are the same story told at 2 different volumes, and the volume was set by us, not by the mountains, and it does not stop there. Let me give you the rest of the tour quickly, because the point is the breadth of it. Back in Alaska, not far from Cupranov, the volcano Great Sitkin has been slowly effusing lava into its summit crater, and it too sits at aviation orange. In the South Pacific, in the island nation of Vanuatu, a volcano called Ambai has produced new eruptive activity, sending ash and gas into the sky, and its alert level has been raised. Back in the Philippines, the volcano Mayon, one of the most beautiful and most dangerous mountains in the country, has continued a grinding, ongoing eruption with lava effusion and pyroclastic density currents, those fast-moving avalanches of superheated gas and rock that are among the deadliest things a volcano can produce. And in Indonesia, the volcano Dukono has simply kept doing what it does, averaging on the order of 50 separate eruptive events per day. Now, I have just listed a lot of volcanoes: Bezimiani, Bulusan, Great Sitkin, Ambai, Mayon, Dukono. And here is where I have to be honest with you, the way this channel always tries to be honest with you, because there is a trap in that list and I do not want you to fall into it. The trap is to hear 6 volcano names in a row and conclude that the world is on fire, that this is an unprecedented and alarming convergence. It is not. And the reason it is not is a single clarifying fact that you should carry with you every time you ever see a news story about volcanoes again. On any given day, on any ordinary, average, nothing special day, somewhere in the range of 40 to 50 volcanoes are erupting somewhere on planet Earth. That is the baseline. That is normal. Right now, today, while you watch this, there are dozens of volcanoes in some state of eruption, and the overwhelming majority of them will never make a single headline anywhere, because they are remote, or they are erupting gently, or they are simply not near anyone. A list of simultaneously active volcanoes is not evidence of anything unusual. It is a Tuesday. It is what the planet does. I cannot stress this number enough because it is the single best antidote to the kind of fear this video is investigating. 40 to 50 volcanoes erupting every single day as a permanent background condition of living on this planet. That has been true your entire life. It was true last year and the year before and a century ago and 1,000 years ago. The Earth is, and always has been, a volcanically active world. That is simply one of its properties, like having oceans or having weather. So the next time you see a piece of content somewhere that breathlessly lists off active volcanoes as though the sheer number proves a crisis, I want you to remember this. The number alone proves nothing, because the number is always large. Anyone can assemble an alarming-looking list of currently erupting volcanoes on any day of any year, because there are always dozens to choose from. The list is not the story. The list is the wallpaper. It is always there, and noticing it does not mean anything has changed. So if a long list of active volcanoes is just normal background, then what, in that tour I just gave you, is actually worth your attention? The answer is precise, and it is important. It is not the count. It is the thresholds. It is not that volcanoes are erupting. It is that specific volcanoes are crossing specific lines. Bezimiani crossing from quieter activity up to aviation orange. Bulusan crossing from quiet into documented new unrest, with 442 earthquakes. Those threshold crossings are the real signal, and here is the genuinely remarkable thing, the thing this whole video is building toward. We can watch them happen. We are watching a volcano in the Philippines tally its earthquakes in near real time. We are watching a Kamchatka volcano's heat signature intensify from orbit. We are seeing these lines get crossed, as they are crossed, with a clarity that no previous generation of human beings could have dreamed of. And that capability, that watching, is the actual story of tonight. So let us now turn and look directly at it. How, exactly, do you watch a volcano that nobody is standing next to? Part 5. How you watch a mountain nobody is standing next to. I have used a few pieces of technology as names so far tonight. I mentioned satellites detecting sulfur dioxide. I mentioned INSAR radar tracking a river of magma underground in Ethiopia. I mentioned seismometers and the crucial fact that Cupranov has none of its own nearby. Now I want to slow all the way down and actually explain these tools, because they are not background detail. They are the spine of this entire story. The reason we are even able to have this conversation, the reason we know that 3 sleeping giants stirred in the last year, is that humanity has, within the last few decades, built an extraordinary set of instruments for listening to a planet that mostly cannot be reached on foot. Let us start with the oldest and most familiar of the 3, the seismometer. A seismometer is, at its heart, a device for detecting the ground moving. The classic mental image is a needle scratching a line on a rolling drum of paper, and while modern instruments are digital and vastly more sensitive, the principle is the same. When the Earth shakes, even imperceptibly, a seismometer records it. And volcanoes shake in very particular ways before they erupt. There are the ordinary brittle earthquakes of rock breaking under stress, but more tellingly, there are those low-frequency events, the ones I described in the very first chapter, the signature of fluid and gas and magma moving through the deep plumbing of the mountain. A trained volcanologist can look at the seismic record of a volcano and read its mood, the way a doctor reads a heartbeat, but seismometers have a fundamental limitation, and the Cupranov story exposed it perfectly. A seismometer only hears well what is close to it. The signal of a small earthquake fades with distance, and so a volcano with instruments planted right on its flanks can detect tiny tremors by the hundreds, while a volcano whose nearest instrument is 27 kilometers away can only hear the loud events, and even those it locates poorly. The whole planet is not, and realistically never will be, blanketed evenly in seismometers. They cost money to install and money to maintain, and they tend to be concentrated where the people are and where the known dangerous volcanoes are, which means that for a remote volcano with no eruptive history and no nearby population, a volcano exactly like Cupranov, the seismic coverage is thin to non-existent. And that is precisely why the second and third tools matter so much, because the second and third tools watch from above, and from above, remoteness does not protect a volcano from being seen. The second tool is the satellite detection of gas, and specifically of sulfur dioxide. I have told you why sulfur dioxide matters. It is the chemical fingerprint of rising magma releasing its dissolved gases. What I have not told you is that there are instruments in orbit right now circling the planet, specifically capable of detecting sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere and mapping where it is coming from. These instruments do not need anyone on the ground. They do not care if a volcano is on a remote Aleutian island or in the middle of an Ethiopian desert. As the satellite passes overhead, it can see the plume of gas, measure it, and flag it. This is how the sulfur dioxide at Cupranov was caught, beginning on the 4th of April, not by a scientist standing on the mountain, by an instrument hundreds of kilometers overhead, looking down, seeing the mountain exhale. There is something worth pausing on with the gas monitoring satellites because it connects 2 of our 3 giants in a way that is easy to miss. The sulfur dioxide that betrayed Cupranov, beginning on the 4th of April, and the sulfur dioxide that was among Hayli Gubbi's first signs of life in late July of last year, were both, in essence, caught the same way, by instruments in orbit looking down. Neither volcano needed a scientist on its slopes, and this is the great gift of satellite gas monitoring. It does not care about remoteness. A volcano can be on an uninhabited Aleutian island, or in a desert that almost no one ever crosses, and it makes no difference, because the satellite passes overhead regardless, on its orbit, indifferent to whether anyone lives below. For the vast unwatched majority of the planet's volcanoes, the ones with no ground instruments at all, satellite gas detection is very often the only watcher they have. It is a thin thread of awareness stretched over an enormous and otherwise blind territory. Thin, but real, and a few decades ago it did not exist at all. And then there is the third tool, and the third tool is, to my mind, the most quietly astonishing of all. It is the one I mentioned in the Ethiopian chapter, INSAR, Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Radar. I'm going to explain how it works, because once you understand it, you will never think about the solid ground beneath your feet the same way again. A radar satellite in orbit bounces radar waves off the surface of the Earth and measures what comes back. Do that once, and you get an image. But the genius of INSAR is in the word interferometric. You take a radar image of a particular patch of ground on one date. Then, days or weeks or months later, The satellite passes over the very same patch of ground and takes another radar image, and then you compare them. Not the brightness of the images, but the phase of the radar waves, the precise timing of the wave peaks and troughs. And from that comparison, from the subtle difference in how long the radar waves took to travel down and back between the two dates, you can calculate whether the ground itself moved, whether it rose or sank in the interval between the two passes, and the precision of this is the part that should genuinely amaze you. INSAR can detect the ground deforming by centimetres, in some configurations by millimetres. From a satellite in orbit, hundreds of kilometres up, travelling at thousands of kilometres an hour, scientists can tell you that a particular hillside in a particular remote desert bulged upward by a couple of centimetres over the last month. And why would the ground bulge? Because something is pushing it up from beneath. Because magma is accumulating, intruding, forcing its way into the crust, and the crust above it is being lifted slightly, like the skin over a slowly inflating balloon. This is how scientists watch the Erupted dike. They did not have a fleet of instruments scattered across the Afar desert, tracking that blade of magma. They had radar satellites, passing overhead, and image after image, and the ground itself recording the passage of the magma in the shape of its own surface. A subtle ridge of uplift, propagating southward, day by day, beneath a desert almost no human being ever sets foot on. 36 kilometres of underground magma migration watched from space. And the same technique that tracked the dike could see it pass beneath Hayli Gubbi and could later be used to model the whole plumbing system, the shallow pockets, and the deeper source, all of it reconstructed from the way the desert's skin had flexed. Think about how recently this would have been pure science fiction. For nearly all of human history, the idea of knowing what magma was doing deep underground in real time beneath a place where no human stood would have been simply unthinkable. The ground was the ground. It was the very definition of the solid, the fixed, the unknowable interior. And now we have a tool that lets us read the movement of molten rock kilometres below the surface by measuring, from space, a flexing of the ground too subtle for any human eye to ever detect standing right on top of it. The scientists who later published the detailed reconstruction of the Hayli Gubbi event were able to say not just that a dike had moved, but how far, how fast, how much magma it carried, and what combination of shallow and deep sources had fed it. They could describe the hidden plumbing of a 12,000-year dormant volcano. That entire body of knowledge was extracted from radar measurements of the shape of a desert. It is, when you really stop and consider it, one of the quiet marvels of our age. It is worth being honest about the limits of INSAR too, because no tool is perfect, and the honesty is part of the point. A radar satellite passes over a given location only periodically, on the schedule of its orbit, so INSAR gives you a series of snapshots, rather than a continuous film. Certain types of terrain and certain conditions can degrade the measurement. And turning the raw radar data into a confident picture of what magma is doing takes expertise, computation, and time. It is not instantaneous and it is not automatic. So INSAR, powerful as it is not an all-seeing eye. It is more like a periodic expert examination, enormously valuable, but not constant and not everywhere. Keep that in mind, because when we get to the holes in our planetary monitoring net, the limits of even our best tools are going to matter. Now put these three tools together, and you have the answer to the question this whole video keeps circling. Seismometers, listening for the shaking, satellite gas sensors, watching for the breath, INSAR radar, measuring the swelling of the ground itself. Together they form a kind of planetary monitoring net, a way of taking the pulse of volcanoes that no human will ever stand beside. And here is the thing I most want you to understand. That net is new. INSAR is a precise routine tool for volcano monitoring as a technology of generously the last 2 to 3 decades. Routine satellite gas monitoring similar. The dense, global, always-on application of these tools is younger still, and in many places it is incomplete, which is exactly why Cupranov could escalate as far as it did with so little watching it. We are, right now, in the first decades of human history in which it is even possible to catch a remote volcano in the act of waking up. And that fact, that simple fact about when these instruments were built, is about to completely reframe the fear we started with. But before it can, we have to confront that fear directly. We have to ask the question out loud, is the planet actually waking up? Part 6. The question we have been circling. Let us now say the frightening thing plainly, the thing that has been sitting underneath this entire video, the thing your mind started assembling the moment I told you that 3 sleeping volcanoes had stirred within a single year. The frightening thing is this. It feels like the planet is waking up. It feels like something has changed, like the Earth itself has shifted into a new and more dangerous gear, and like the eruptions and the earthquakes and the unrest are all symptoms of one great, ominous, underlying cause. That is the fear, and tonight we are not going to mock that fear, and we are not going to dismiss it with a wave of the hand. We are going to take it seriously, walk all the way around it, and look at exactly what holds it up and what does not. So let us give the frightening story its best case first. Its best case is genuinely the pattern. Within 12 months, a volcano silent through all of recorded human history began to stir. A volcano silent for 12,000 years exploded. A volcano silent for 5 centuries roared back to life. And alongside them, a Kamchatkan volcano went to orange, a Philippine volcano logged 442 earthquakes, and a half-dozen others churned away in various states of eruption. Stacked up like that, in a single paragraph, in a single year, it is undeniably a striking picture. The human pattern recognition instinct looks at that and screams that it cannot be coincidence. Something, that instinct insists, must be connecting all of this. And that instinct, the connecting instinct, is where the frightening story actually lives. It is not really the individual eruptions that frighten people. It is the sense that they are linked, that they are notes in a single chord, that one hidden cause is playing all of them at once. So that is the claim we have to test. Are these events connected? Is there a single planetary cause? And here is where everything we have built so far pays off. Because we did not just hear that 3 volcanoes erupted, we examined in detail how each one of them woke up, and what did we find? We found 3 mechanisms that have, quite literally, nothing to do with one another. Cupranov is being woken from directly below, by a body of magma slowly intruding upward into it, a process driven by the local conditions of one specific volcanic system on the Alaska Peninsula. Hayli Gubbi was woken from the side, reactivated by a dike of magma that travelled underground from a completely different volcano, a process driven by the specific tectonics of the East African Rift, half a world away. Krasheninnikov was woken, or accelerated, by the seismic shock of a magnitude 8.8 earthquake on the Kamchatka megathrust, a process driven by the collision of 2 tectonic plates in the North Pacific. There is no thread connecting those 3 things. There cannot be. They are happening on 3 different tectonic plates, in 3 different kinds of geological setting, driven by 3 different physical processes operating on 3 different scales. A dike propagating through the Afar Desert has no causal relationship whatsoever to magma, intruding under an Alaskan stratovolcano. They are not in communication. The Earth does not have a nervous system. There is no mechanism, none, by which the world's volcanoes are wired together into a single synchronized network that could be switched on all at once. The crust of the planet is not a single instrument. It is thousands of separate instruments, each playing its own slow music on its own schedule, driven by its own local conditions. So what about the timing? If there is no connection, how do we explain 3 reactivations landing inside a single year? And the answer to that is one of the most important and most counterintuitive ideas in all of statistics, so I am going to take real care with it. The answer is that genuinely random events do not arrive in smooth, evenly spaced intervals. Randomness is clumpy. Randomness produces clusters. If you scatter a handful of sand across a table, you do not get a perfectly even coating. You get clumps and gaps and little constellations purely by chance. If volcanic reactivations occur at some long-term average rate scattered through time, then by the simple mathematics of randomness, some years will have none, many years will have one, and occasionally, inevitably, a year will have 3. The cluster is not evidence of a cause. The cluster is what randomness looks like. A run of notable events with no shared mechanism falling within a single year is not a signal. It is the texture of chance itself, and there is more, because the geological record backs this up directly. Volcanic activity has always been episodic. It has always been clumpy in time. Look at the long history of any volcanic region, and you will find decades of relative quiet and then bursts of activity, with no external master cause orchestrating the rhythm. The clustering is intrinsic. It is how volcanic systems have always behaved, across all of geological time, long before there were any humans around to feel alarmed about it. There is a thinking trap worth naming here directly, because it is the engine underneath the frightening story, and it catches almost everyone. It is the tendency to notice the hits and quietly forget the misses. When 3 notable volcanoes reactivate in a single year, that year stamps itself on our memory as alarming, as a year something happened. But the years in which no long-dormant volcano reactivates, the quiet years, leave no mark at all. We do not remember them, because nothing happened to remember. So our sense of the rate of these events is built almost entirely from the dramatic years and almost not at all from the quiet ones, and that lopsided memory makes any cluster feel far more significant than it is. To judge honestly whether something is truly increasing, you cannot just count the alarming year. You have to count the silent years too, all of them, the ones that left no trace. And when researchers do that, when they look at the full record rather than the memorable highlights, the established scientific position is clear and worth repeating plainly. There is no established evidence that the global rate of volcanic eruptions is rising. I will add one more layer of honesty here, because this channel does not deal in tidy reassurance, and there is a genuine subtlety that deserves to be said out loud. Could a small, real increase in volcanic activity be hiding inside all of this, masked by the noise of our rapidly improving detection? In truth, that would be a genuinely difficult thing to rule out completely. Our ability to detect volcanic unrest has been improving so fast that disentangling a true change in the planet from a change in our instruments is a real scientific challenge. So the fully honest position is not a chest-thumping certainty, it is this. The evidence does not show an increase. The cluster we are discussing is fully explained without one, and the burden of proof sits squarely on anyone claiming otherwise. But a careful person holds a small, humble question mark, not because the frightening story has any support, but because intellectual honesty means admitting the limits of what our young instruments can yet confirm. That humility, as it turns out, is going to become the whole point by the time we reach the end. So here is where the investigation has brought us. The frightening story, the story of a connected, synchronized planetary awakening, does not survive contact with the evidence. The 3 giants do not share a cause. Their timing is consistent with ordinary chance. The mainstream scientific position is clear, and it is reassuring on this specific point. There is no established evidence that the global rate of volcanic eruptions is increasing. The planet is not waking up. But, and I need you to stay with me here, because if I stopped at that comfortable conclusion, I would be doing you a disservice. We have answered one question, the question of whether the volcanoes are connected, and the answer is no. But that answer creates a new question, a harder one. And it is the question that the rest of this video exists to face. Because if the planet is not doing anything unusual, then why does it feel like it is? Why are we suddenly aware of all these sleeping giants? What changed? Something changed. And the answer is not under the ground. The answer is us. Part 7. It was never the planet. It was always us. If the volcanoes are not connected, and if volcanic activity is not actually increasing, then we are left with a real puzzle, and it is not a trivial one. Because the feeling is real, the sense that there is suddenly more volcanic news, more sleeping giants stirring, more unrest to worry about, that feeling is not a delusion. It corresponds to something genuine. There genuinely is more volcanic awakening reaching your attention than there would have been a few decades ago. So if the planet did not change, then the only thing left that could have changed is the part of the equation that involves us, our instruments, our awareness, our ability to see. And this is the heart of the whole video. This is the idea I have been carefully laying the groundwork for since the first sentence. The reason it feels like the world's volcanoes are waking up is not that they are waking up more often. It is that, for the first time in human history, we can actually catch them in the act. We have, within the span of a few decades, installed the instruments to hear a planet that was always making this exact noise. The volcanoes were always doing this. We were simply deaf to it, and now, increasingly, we are not. Think back through everything we have covered and look at it again through this lens. Mount Cupranov has, as far as we know, no eruptions in all of recorded history. But think about what recorded history actually means for a remote, ice-covered peak on the Alaska Peninsula. For most of the human past, there was no one there to record anything. A volcano like Cupranov could have stirred, could have whispered, could have had episodes of unrest exactly like the one happening now, a dozen times over the last few thousand years, and not one of those episodes would have been written down, because there was no one watching and no instrument listening. The absence of Cupranov from the historical record does not prove the mountain was inert. It proves the mountain was unwatched. Those are completely different things, and the difference between them is the difference between this video being frightening and this video being, in a strange way, reassuring. What happened at Cupranov this spring is not that a uniquely dead volcano did something unprecedented. What happened is that for the first time, the instruments existed to notice. Satellites capable of detecting its sulfur dioxide, regional seismometers capable of catching at least the louder of its earthquakes, a monitoring agency, the Alaska Volcano Observatory, with the tools and the mandate to put the pieces together and raise an alert. The unrest at Cupranov may be genuinely routine, in the deep time life of that mountain. What is not routine, what is genuinely new in the history of our species, is that we saw it. Take the same lens to Hayli Gubbi. We did not just learn that Hayli Gubbi erupted, we learned, in remarkable detail, why. We watched a dike of magma travel 36 kilometers underground. We traced its path beneath the mountain. We later reconstructed the entire plumbing system, the shallow pockets, and the deep source, from radar measurements of how the desert's surface flexed. None of that, not one piece of it, would have been possible for any previous generation. 100 years ago, Hayli Gubbi could have erupted and the world might barely have noticed, a remote explosion in a remote desert. We did not just notice, we understood it. And understanding, that depth of insight into a 12,000-year dormant volcano, is a thing that simply did not exist before the satellite era. And here is a thought that follows directly, and that I find genuinely sobering. The dike that reactivated Hayli Gubbi travelled 36 kilometers underground. That is not a small or a rare kind of event in a rifting zone like the Afar. Lateral dike intrusions of significant length are part of how that landscape works, which means that, almost certainly, similar dikes have propagated through the Afar crust before, many times, across the long history of that region. And every one of those earlier dikes that happened before the satellite era passed completely unwitnessed. Magma migrated, dormant volcanoes were perhaps plumbed in or perhaps not. The crust did its slow, violent work, and not a single human being recorded any of it, because the tools to record it did not exist. The Hayli Gubbi event is not remarkable, because it was the first time the Afar did something like this. It is remarkable, because it is one of the first times we were watching when the Afar did something like this. The novelty is entirely on our side of the equation. Even Krasheninnikov fits the pattern. Yes, the magnitude 8.8 earthquake was real and enormous, and the triggered volcanism connection is a genuine scientific hypothesis. But notice that the entire story, the earthquake, the 4-day gap, the eruption, the statement that 7 volcanoes responded, all of it depended on a dense modern monitoring apparatus to even be perceived as a story. 300 years ago, the last time Kamchatka saw a comparable cluster of volcanic response, there was no one to tally it, no global volcanism program to put a date on Krasheninnikov's previous eruption, no instruments to measure the earthquake at 8.8. The events would have happened. The perception of them as a connected, documented sequence would not have. So this is the resolution, and I want to state it as clearly as I possibly can. The cluster of awakening volcanoes is not proof that the Earth has become more dangerous. It is proof that we have become more aware. The danger was always there. The volcanoes were always doing this, on their own ancient and indifferent schedules, through every century of human history, including all the centuries when we could not see it. What is new is the watching, and the watching is not a bad thing. The watching is the single greatest improvement in volcanic safety in the history of our species. Every sleeping giant we catch stirring is a giant we get to prepare for, instead of one that simply arrives one morning with no warning at all. But, and you may have noticed by now that this video keeps turning a comforting answer into a harder question, there is an unsettling edge to this resolution, and I am not going to hide it from you. If our awareness is the thing that changed, then our awareness is also incomplete. The net we have built has holes in it, and the clearest proof of that, the proof we have been carrying since the very first chapter, is Cupranov itself, with its nearest seismometer 27 kilometers away. We caught Cupranov, but we very nearly did not, and we caught it late, and we caught only the loud part of it. Which forces the question that the rest of this video has to face. If we're only now learning to watch, and our watching still has holes this large, then what is happening right now in the holes? Part 8. The holes in the net. I want to return to a number because it has been sitting quietly in this story since the beginning, and it deserves to be brought all the way into the light. 27 kilometers. That is the distance from Mount Cupranov to the nearest seismometer capable of recording its earthquakes. 27 kilometers of Alaskan wilderness between a waking volcano and the closest instrument able to hear it. I've called this a monitoring gap, and now I want to show you just how consequential a gap like that really is, because it is the key to understanding everything we cannot see. When the Alaska Volcano Observatory recorded that magnitude 3.1 earthquake beneath Cupranov in late April, they were able to do so because a magnitude 3.1 is large enough to send detectable seismic waves across 27 kilometers of crust. But seismic energy obeys a simple and unforgiving rule. It weakens with distance. The further the waves travel, the more they spread out and lose amplitude, until eventually they sink below the background noise of the planet and become undetectable. For a seismometer 27 kilometers from its target, there is a whole category of small earthquakes, the magnitude 1s and 2s, and the smaller events still, that simply never make it. They happen, they release their energy, and they vanish unrecorded because there was no instrument close enough to catch them before they faded. Now, why does that matter so much? It matters because, at a volcano, the small earthquakes are not noise. They are the signal. They are the most abundant and often the most informative part of the seismic story. A volcano building toward an eruption typically produces small earthquakes in great numbers, swarms of them, hundreds or thousands of tiny events that, taken together, trace the movement of magma and map the stressing of the rock. A well-instrumented volcano with seismometers on its flanks catches that whole rich texture. It hears the volcano in high definition. A volcano monitored only from 27 kilometers away is heard, at best, in a blurry, low-resolution way. You get the loud events, you miss the detail, and the detail is where the early warning lives. So consider what the Cupranov case actually demonstrates. The scientists were clear about this, and it is worth restating in the plainest terms. Because the nearest station is so far away, the recorded magnitude 3.1 may well not have been the largest or the only significant earthquake beneath that mountain. It is the largest one that was caught. The volcano may have been considerably more active than the catalogue shows. We were not seeing Cupranov clearly. We were seeing a shadow of Cupranov, an outline assembled from only the loudest fragments of its activity, and we were lucky that even that shadow was enough to prompt an alert. And here is the part that should genuinely give you pause. Cupranov is not some unique, forgotten outlier. Cupranov is normal, it is representative. There are volcanoes all over the planet in exactly its situation, or worse. Volcanoes with no local seismic network at all. Volcanoes in remote places, on uninhabited islands, in deserts, in mountain ranges far from any town, far from any instrument. The global monitoring net that I described to you, the beautiful combination of seismometers and gas-sensing satellites, an INSAR radar, is real. And it is powerful, but it is not evenly woven. It is dense where the people are. It is dense around the famous known dangerous volcanoes that have hurt people before, and it is thin, sometimes to the point of being non-existent, everywhere else. The satellites help enormously here, and I do not want to undersell them. Gas-sensing instruments and INSAR radar pass over the whole planet, the remote parts as well as the populated parts, and they do not need anyone on the ground. They are the great equalizers of volcano monitoring. But even they have limits. Satellites pass over a given spot only periodically, not continuously. Cloud cover can obscure some kinds of observation. The analysis takes expertise and time. A satellite might catch a volcano's sulfur dioxide, but turning that detection into a confident understanding of what the volcano is doing still often requires the ground-based instruments that the remote volcanoes lack. The satellites widen the net, but they do not make it seamless. And there is a subtler limitation to the satellite layer that is worth naming, because it is easy to assume that an instrument in orbit sees everything. It does not. A satellite sees what it is built and tasked to see at the moments it happens to be overhead, and only when conditions allow. A volcano's earliest, faintest signs of unrest, the deepest whispers, the smallest gas emissions, can fall below what an orbiting instrument can resolve. By the time a remote volcano is emitting enough sulfur dioxide for a satellite to flag it confidently, it may already be well along in its awakening. The satellites are extraordinary, but they are better at catching a volcano that is already clearly stirring than at catching the very first, faintest moments of the process. The earliest whisper, the part that buys the most warning time, is exactly the part that the ground instruments hear best, and exactly the part that the remote ground instrument-free volcanoes therefore lose. So the net is not just thin in places, it is thinnest precisely at the stage where early detection would matter most. So let us put the uncomfortable conclusion into words. We have in the last few decades built the best volcano monitoring system in the history of the human species, and that system, the best we have ever had, still came within a hair of missing the awakening of an entire volcano on American soil, and even when it caught Cupranov, it caught it late and partially and from 27 kilometers away. That is the state of the art. That is as good as we currently are. And if that is as good as we are, then somewhere out there right now, in the remote and the unwatched and the unglamorous corners of the planet, there are almost certainly volcanoes doing exactly what Cupranov is doing. Stirring, whispering, intruding magma, beginning the slow climb from sleep toward wakefulness. And for some of them, there is no instrument close enough to hear it. No satellite analyst who happens to be looking. No alert being drafted. They are crossing the early thresholds in total silence, as far as human awareness is concerned, exactly the way Cupranov itself was doing just a few months ago, before we noticed. That is the hole in the net. And it is worth sitting with, not as a doom prophecy, but as a piece of honest perspective. We have come so far. We can watch a river of magma move underground from space, and we still cannot see everything, and we know we cannot, and the gaps are large. But before we follow that thought to its end, I want to turn and deal with something else, because there is an event happening in the news right now that looks, on its surface, like it belongs in this video, like it is a fourth sleeping giant. And it is not. And understanding why it is not will sharpen everything we have said so far. Part 9. The Volcano That Was Not a Volcano. If you have been following the news in the last several days, there is a good chance you have seen headlines about Hawaii, specifically about a significant earthquake that struck the Big Island. And if you have been watching this video closely, your instinct right now might be to slot that Hawaiian earthquake neatly into our story. A volcano story. Hawaii, after all, is practically synonymous with volcanoes, and there is one erupting there right now. So surely a major earthquake on the Big Island, in the same week we are talking about sleeping giants waking up, belongs on the list. I want to take that instinct, and I want to gently, carefully take it apart, because doing so is going to sharpen everything we have built tonight into a fine point. Here are the facts. In the last several days, a magnitude 6 earthquake struck the Big Island of Hawaii, centered roughly 12 to 13 kilometers south of the community of Honaunau-Napupu, on the Kona side of the island, at a depth somewhere in the range of 16 to 22 kilometers, depending on which catalogue you consult. It was a genuinely significant earthquake. In fact, it was the only earthquake anywhere on the entire planet that week to receive a damage alert from the United States Geological Survey. It was felt across multiple Hawaiian islands, and it happened on an island where the volcano Kilauea is, right now, in the middle of an ongoing eruption at its summit, so you have all the ingredients for a connection: a big earthquake, an erupting volcano, the same island, the same week. And I would bet that a great many people seeing those headlines drew exactly the line your instinct wants to draw. Volcano erupting, ground shaking violently, of course they are the same story. Of course the earthquake is the volcano flexing its muscles, or the eruption escalating, or some dramatic convulsion of an awakening mountain. Except it is not. And the reason it is not is a beautiful illustration of why this channel insists on looking carefully instead of looking fast. That magnitude 6 earthquake was relatively deep, down in that 16 to 22 kilometer range, and it was located away from the active summit plumbing of Kilauea. The United States Geological Survey and the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, the people whose entire job is to understand exactly this, found no causal link between the earthquake and the ongoing eruption. They are not the same event. They are not cause and effect. They are two separate things that happened to share an island in a week. So what was the earthquake, if not the volcano? The answer is one of the most elegant and underappreciated facts in all of geology, and it has to do with the sheer, staggering weight of the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian Islands are enormous piles of volcanic rock. They were built, over millions of years, by a hotspot in the Earth's mantle, eruption upon eruption, until they became some of the largest mountains on the planet when measured from their true base on the deep ocean floor. And here is the thing about putting a mountain that heavy onto the thin oceanic crust of the Pacific. The crust cannot simply hold it up rigidly. The weight of the islands actually flexes the crust beneath and around them. It bends the sea floor. The Pacific plate beneath Hawaii is being pushed down and warped by the immense load of the island sitting on top of it, the way a heavy person sitting on a stiff mattress creates a depression that extends beyond their body. That flexing, that bending of the crust under the weight of the islands generates stress, and every so often that stress is released as an earthquake, a structural earthquake, a tectonic earthquake, an earthquake that has nothing whatsoever to do with magma rising or a volcano erupting, and everything to do with the fact that the islands are so heavy they are deforming the very plate they rest on. That is the best current understanding of the magnitude 6 event near Hononaunapupu. It is the crust groaning under an immense load. It is the same general mechanism behind other large earthquakes the Big Island has experienced. It is not Kilauea. It is not a sleeping giant waking up. It is the planet's crust flexing beneath the weight of a mountain. And I want to draw out why the depth of the earthquake is such a strong clue here, because depth is one of the most useful things a seismologist can know. The active plumbing of Kilauea's summit eruption, the magma actually feeding the activity at the surface, lives in the shallow crust in the uppermost few kilometers. That is where the eruption's business is conducted. But the Hononaunapupu earthquake originated well below that, down in the 16 to 22 kilometer range. It happened in the wrong place to be part of the eruption. It happened down in the zone where the crust is being structurally flexed by the load of the islands, not up in the zone where the magma is moving. So when the United States Geological Survey and the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory looked at this event and found no causal link to the eruption, that was not a guess or a hedge. It was a conclusion grounded in exactly this kind of evidence. The depth was wrong, the location was offset from the active plumbing, and the character of the event was tectonic, not volcanic. The science here is not ambiguous. Two things happened on one island in 1 week, and they were not the same thing. Now, if you are a long-time viewer of this channel, all of this will sound familiar, because we devoted our entire previous video to exactly this Hawaiian earthquake, to the oceanic plate flexure mechanism, to untangling it from the eruption of Kilauea. So I am not going to walk all the way through it again. If you want the deep version, the full story of how an island can be heavy enough to bend the crust of the Earth, it is waiting for you in that last video. What I want to do here is simply use Hawaii for one sharp, specific purpose, as a contrast, as the counterexample that proves the rule. Because here is what the Hawaiian earthquake teaches us, in the context of tonight's story. It teaches us what volcanic reactivation is not. Tonight we have looked at 3 genuine cases of sleeping giants stirring, and every one of them had the real signature. Cupranov had the rising magma, the sulfur dioxide, the fluid-driven low-frequency earthquakes. Hayli Gubbi had the dike, the documented underground migration of molten rock. Krasheninnikov had a primed volcanic system pushed over the edge. In every genuine case there was magma, and there was the specific fingerprint of magma moving. The Hawaiian earthquake has none of that. It is a big, dramatic, attention-grabbing event on an island with a famous volcano, and it is, mechanically, completely unrelated to volcanic awakening. It is a tectonic event. It is the crust flexing under weight, and that is exactly why it belongs in this video, as the thing that does not belong. Because the lesson of tonight is not that everything dramatic is a sign of the planet stirring. The lesson is the opposite. The lesson is that you have to look at the mechanism. You have to ask what is actually physically happening underground. A real reactivation looks like Cupranov, like Hayli Gubbi, like Krasheninnikov. It does not look like a heavy island flexing the seafloor. Tell the difference. Insist on telling the difference. And the world gets a great deal clearer. blur them together, and you end up frightened of a pattern that is not there. So let us carry that discipline, that insistence on mechanism, into the last thing we have to deal with before we close, the stories that the careful look is designed to protect you from. Part 10. The stories people tell when volcanoes cluster. Whenever volcanoes cluster in the news, whenever a run of eruptions and unrest stacks up the way it has over this last year, a particular set of stories rises up alongside them. They spread quickly, they are emotionally compelling, and they offer something that careful science often does not, which is a single, simple, satisfying answer. I want to spend some time on these stories because I do not think the right response to them is mockery. I think the right response is to take them seriously enough to actually examine them and then to show, honestly and with the evidence, where they hold up and where they fall apart. Because the people drawn to these stories are usually not foolish. They are usually just pattern-seeking humans looking at a genuinely striking pattern, which is exactly what we have been doing all night. The first story is the big one, and we have already done most of the work of dismantling it, so here I just want to name it directly. It is the story that the volcanoes are all connected, that what we are witnessing is a coordinated planetary awakening, the Earth itself shifting into a new and angrier state with the eruptions as its symptoms, and I have a great deal of sympathy for why this story feels true. We have spent this whole video on the very cluster that makes it feel true, but we have also done the thing that the story cannot survive. We looked at the mechanisms: 3 giants, 3 completely independent causes, a magmatic intrusion, and a lateral dike and an earthquake trigger, operating on 3 plates in 3 settings with no physical connection between them. The Earth has no nervous system. There is no wire running between the world's volcanoes. The clustering in time is the ordinary clumping of random events, and volcanic activity has always been episodic. The connected awakening story is the single most natural story to tell, and it is also the one the evidence most clearly refuses to support. The second story is more specific, and it grows directly out of something true, which is what makes it interesting. It is the story that says there is no monitoring out there for a reason, that the gaps in the net, the missing seismometers, the unwatched volcanoes, are not an accident or a budget problem but a deliberate choice, that someone somewhere does not want certain volcanoes watched. And the reason this story has teeth is that the first half of it is completely correct. The monitoring gaps are real. I have spent an entire chapter of this video insisting on exactly that. Cupranov really did have its nearest seismometer 27 kilometers away. The net really does have holes. But look at what the honest explanation for those gaps actually is, because it is mundane all the way down. Monitoring networks cost money. A seismometer is not just an instrument you drop on a mountain. It has to be installed, powered, maintained, connected, and serviced, often in brutally remote and difficult terrain. There is a finite amount of money and expertise in the world for this work, and so it gets allocated by priority. The volcanoes that get the dense networks are the ones near cities, the ones near airports, the ones with a history of hurting people. A remote, ice-covered peak on the Alaska Peninsula with no eruptive history and no town anywhere near it sits, very rationally, near the bottom of that priority list. The gap at Cupranov is not a conspiracy, it is a spreadsheet. It is the entirely visible consequence of limited resources meeting an enormous planet. And there is a detail that demolishes the concealment version of this story completely. Everything I have told you tonight came from public information. The Alaska Volcano Observatory published its notices about Cupranov openly, for anyone to read. The Smithsonian's Global Volcanism Program publishes its weekly reports openly. The earthquake catalogues are public. The satellite data and the research papers, including the detailed reconstruction of the Hayli Gubbi dike, are public. This video exists because the information is open. A genuine cover-up does not look like a government agency publishing detailed bulletins about a volcano it just raised to advisory. It looks like silence. And there was no silence. There was a steady, public, freely available stream of exactly the data we use to tell this story. The third story is the one about external forces. It is the family of claims that says the real trigger for all of this is something coming from outside the Earth. That solar activity is setting off the volcanoes, that cosmic rays are doing it, that planetary alignments, the positions of other planets in the sky, are reaching across space to pull eruptions out of the ground. These claims circulate reliably whenever volcanic stories cluster, and they have an appealing grandeur to them, but they run into a wall, and the wall is energy. The processes that drive volcanic eruptions, the heat and the pressure and the buoyancy of magma, involve titanic amounts of energy stored within the Earth itself. The gravitational tug of a distant planet, the flux of cosmic rays, the variations in solar output, these are real phenomena. But the energy they could plausibly deliver to a magma chamber is not remotely in the same universe as the energy that magma chamber already contains. There is no established physical mechanism by which any of these external forces triggers a volcanic eruption, and the scale of the energies involved is the simplest way to see why. The trigger for a volcano is, overwhelmingly, inside the Earth, in the slow churning of heat and rock that has been running for billions of years. Let me make the energy point concrete, because abstractions about energy scales are easy to wave past, and this deserves to land. A volcano is fed by the internal heat of the Earth, heat left over from the planet's formation, and continuously generated by the decay of radioactive elements deep in the interior. That heat has been driving the slow convection of the mantle for billions of years. It is the energy budget of an entire planet's interior. Now set against that the gravitational influence of, say, the alignment of a few planets in the sky. The tidal effect of the moon and the sun on the solid Earth is real and measurable. The ground beneath you genuinely rises and falls by a small amount twice a day, but it is a gentle, rhythmic flexing, and the additional contribution of the distant planets is smaller still, by an enormous margin. To suggest that this faint distant tug is what determines whether a magma chamber, holding the heat of the planet's interior, decides to erupt, is to imagine a feather tipping over a mountain. The numbers are not close, they are not in the same range, they are not in the same story. And that is why, when scientists are asked about these external trigger claims, the answer is not contempt. It is simply arithmetic. The energy is not there. I want to be fair to the impulse behind these claims, though, because mockery teaches nothing. The impulse is the same one we have been honouring all night. The search for a single, comprehensible cause behind a striking pattern. When the true explanation is statistical, when the honest answer is that randomness clusters and that our awareness has changed, that can feel unsatisfying, because it does not give you a villain or a switch or a grand hidden mechanism. A solar trigger, a planetary alignment, these at least offer a story with a clear cause and a clear effect. But the universe is not obligated to give us satisfying stories, and the job of anyone who genuinely wants to understand the world is to follow the evidence even when it leads somewhere less dramatic than we hoped. The evidence here leads to the inside of the Earth and to the inside of our own pattern-seeking minds, and not to the sky. So here is the through line of all three stories. Each one takes something real, the striking cluster, the genuine monitoring gaps, the human hunger for a grand cause, and reaches for an explanation that is simpler and more dramatic and more intentional than the truth. And the truth we have assembled all night, is less dramatic but far more interesting. The volcanoes are not connected. The gaps are just resource limits. The triggers are inside the Earth. And the actual remarkable thing, the genuinely new and astonishing thing in this whole story, is not a hidden hand. It is the instruments. It is the fact that we built the tools to watch. That is the real revelation, and it does not need a conspiracy to make it extraordinary. So let us now take everything, all 10 chapters of it, and bring it home. Part 11. Reading the Three Giants Together. We have come a long way, and before I take you to the final and hardest version of this story's central question, I want to pull all three of our sleeping giants back into view and read them together, as a set, one last time. Because when you lay them side by side with everything we now know, they tell a single clear story, and it is not the story we started with. Start with what they have in common, because at first glance it is striking. All three were long dormant. All three came back to life within a single 12-month window. All three are genuine, verified, well-documented reactivations of volcanoes that had been silent for spans of time that humble the entire history of human civilization. If you stopped there, if you only looked at the surface, you would have every reason to feel that cold thing in your stomach, the sense of a planet stirring. That is the surface reading, and the surface reading is the frightening one. But we did not stop at the surface. We went down into each one, and the moment you go down, the moment you ask the question how, the apparent unity shatters into three completely separate stories. Cupranov is a volcano being slowly woken from directly beneath, by a body of magma intruding upward into a system on the Alaska Peninsula, its unrest written in low-frequency earthquakes and rising sulfur dioxide, its escalation a careful climb from unassigned to advisory. Hayli Gubbi is a volcano that did not wake itself at all, that was reached and reactivated from the side by a blade of magma that travelled 36 kilometres underground from an active neighbour in the East African Rift. Its 12,000-year sleep ended not by its own clock, but by another mountain's eruption. Krasheninnikov is a volcano that was very likely already climbing toward an eruption on its own, and was then shoved over the threshold, its timeline compressed from years into 4 days, by the seismic violence of the 6th largest earthquake ever recorded, a magmatic intrusion from below, a lateral dike from the side, a great earthquake from 140 miles away, 3 mechanisms, 3 plates, 3 kinds of geology. There is no single cause hiding behind those 3 events, because 3 things that different cannot have a single cause. That is the mechanistic reading, and the mechanistic reading dissolves the fear. The giants are not connected. Their simultaneity is the ordinary clumpiness of chance, the same clumpiness that scatters sand into clusters, the same episodic rhythm volcanic systems have always followed across all of geological time. And notice something about those 3 mechanisms that is, in its own way, reassuring. Each of them is a known process. Magmatic intrusion from below is something volcanologists understand and have documented at volcanoes around the world. Lateral dike propagation is a well-studied phenomenon, particularly in rift settings like the Afar. Earthquake-triggered volcanism is a recognized, if nuanced, part of the scientific literature. None of the 3 giants required scientists to invent a new kind of physics to explain it. None of them was a mystery that broke the rulebook. Each one was the textbook behaving exactly as the textbook says it should. That is worth holding on to, because the frightening story implicitly relies on the idea that something unprecedented and unexplained is happening. But nothing unexplained happened here. 3 volcanoes did 3 understood things. The only thing that was genuinely new, the only thing the textbook of a century ago could not have provided, was our front row seat. And then there is the 3rd reading, the deepest one, the one this entire video has been built to deliver, and it is the one I most want you to carry out of here. The 3rd reading asks a different question entirely. Not what do the 3 giants have in common in the ground, but what do they have in common in us? It is a strange pivot to make, because all night we have been looking downward, into the crust, into magma and dikes and megathrusts. The 3rd reading asks us to turn the gaze around, away from the planet and toward the observer, and the answer is everything. The thing that genuinely unites Cupranov and Hayli Gubbi and Krasheninnikov is not a geological cause. It is that we saw all 3. It is that, for the first time in the history of our species, the instruments existed to catch a remote Alaskan volcano, exhaling sulfur dioxide, to trace a river of magma migrating beneath an Ethiopian desert, to document in fine detail a Kamchatkan volcano roaring back after 5 centuries of silence. The 3 giants are not connected by anything under the ground. They are connected by the satellites overhead, and the seismometers, and the scientists reading them. They are connected by the watching. That is the resolution. The planet did not change. We did. We did not discover a world that suddenly became more volcanic. We became a civilization that can finally see the volcanism that was always there. Every century before ours, sleeping giants stirred and woke and sometimes erupted, and the overwhelming majority of those events passed entirely unseen, unrecorded, unmourned, unknown. We are simply the first humans standing in a position to watch the planet do what it has always done. And I will say again what I said before, because it is the genuinely hopeful core of all this. That watching is not a curse. It is the single greatest advance in volcanic safety we have ever achieved. A volcano you can see waking up is a volcano you can prepare for. The alternative, the old way, the way of every previous century, was not safety. It was just ignorance, an ignorance that ended sometimes in catastrophe with no warning at all. So if the video ended here, it would end on something like reassurance. The fear was based on a misreading. The planet is not waking up. We just learned to listen, and learning to listen is good. But I told you, several times tonight, that this video has a habit of turning every comfortable answer into a harder question. And it does it one more time, here, at the end. Because the resolution we just reached has a shadow attached to it, and the shadow is shaped exactly like Mount Cupranov. Part 12. The question in the gaps. Here is the shadow. We just concluded, and I believe it is the correct conclusion, that the cluster of waking volcanoes is not a frightening sign about the planet, but a hopeful sign about us, about our new ability to watch. But that conclusion rests entirely on the watching being good enough. And we have spent an entire chapter of this video establishing in detail that it is not. Not yet. The net has holes. And the same Cupranov story that gave us our reassurance also gave us our warning, because Cupranov was very nearly missed. Let that sink back in. Cupranov is in the United States. It is on the Alaska Peninsula, within the territory of a wealthy nation with one of the best volcano monitoring agencies on the planet, the Alaska Volcano Observatory, an organization staffed by genuine experts with real resources. And even there, even with all of that, the nearest seismometer to a waking volcano was 27 kilometers away. Even there, the awakening was caught late, and caught partially, and the scientists themselves acknowledged that the activity they recorded was probably only the loudest fraction of what the mountain was actually doing. If that is what the monitoring gap looks like inside the United States, at a volcano that did, in the end, get an alert, then think about what the gap looks like everywhere the resources are thinner and the volcanoes are even more remote. So here is the question, the final question, the one I have been walking you towards since the first whisper, 12 miles beneath Alaska. We resolved the question we started with. Is the planet waking up? No. The planet is doing what it has always done, and we are simply, finally, learning to watch it. But that resolved question has been replaced by a harder one, and the harder one is this. How many sleeping giants are stirring right now, tonight, in the gaps between our instruments, with no seismometer close enough to hear the whisper? Because the logic is inescapable. We know volcanoes reactivate. We have just watched 3 of them do it. We know the processes of reactivation, the rising magma, the sulfur dioxide, the swarms of small earthquakes, the slow swelling of the ground, are physical processes that happen whether or not anyone is watching. A volcano does not wait for a seismometer to be installed before it begins to wake. And we know, because Cupranov proved it, that vast stretches of the planet's volcanic regions are thinly monitored or not monitored at all. Put those 3 facts together and the conclusion is not speculation. It is close to a certainty. Somewhere out there right now, on a remote island, in an empty desert, along an unwatched stretch of some mountain range, there are volcanoes doing exactly what Cupranov was doing last winter, whispering, intruding magma, beginning the long, quiet climb from sleep toward wakefulness. And no one is hearing them because there is nothing there to hear. Now, I want to be careful, because I have spent this whole video being careful, and I am not going to abandon that in the final minutes. This is not a doom prophecy. The fact that unwatched volcanoes are stirring does not mean catastrophe is coming. Most volcanic unrest does not lead to a major eruption. Most of those whispering giants will murmur for a while and quiet back down, exactly as volcanoes have always done. The point is not that we are in danger. The point is subtler and, I think, more important than simple danger. The point is about the limits of what we know. We have built something genuinely magnificent. A planetary monitoring net woven from seismometers and satellites and radar. A system that can trace magma underground from orbit. A system that represents the first time our species has ever been able to take the pulse of the world's volcanoes at all. We should be proud of that net. But we should also be honest, completely honest, about the fact that it is unfinished. It has holes, and the holes are large, and inside those holes the planet is still doing things we cannot see. The story of the 3 sleeping giants is, in the end, not really a story about 3 volcanoes. It is a story about the edge of human knowledge, about the boundary between the part of the planet we have learned to watch and the much larger part we have not yet reached. So we are left holding 2 truths at once. We can see more than any humans before us ever could, and we still cannot see most of it. Both of those things are true, and the space between them, the dark, unwatched, whispering space between them, is exactly where the next sleeping giant is going to wake up. Which raises one last question, and it is a question not about the past, but about the future. If the holes in the net are the problem, then what would it actually take to close them? Part 13. What it would take to hear them all. I have spent most of this video looking backward, at 3 volcanoes that have already woken, and a fourth event that only looked like one. I want to end by looking forward, because the story of the sleeping giants does not really have an ending. It has a trajectory, and the trajectory depends entirely on a single choice, made and remade by human beings, about how much of the planet we decide to listen to. Think about where we actually stand. In the span of just a few decades, our species has gone from being almost completely deaf to the awakening of remote volcanoes, to being able, at least sometimes, to catch one in the act, to trace magma underground from orbit, to counter distant volcanoes' earthquakes in near real time. That is a staggering rate of progress. If you compressed the whole history of volcano monitoring into a single day, then the seismometer networks, the gas-sensing satellites, the INSAR radar, almost everything that made tonight's story possible would all have arrived in the final minutes before midnight. We are not at the end of building this monitoring net. We are very near the beginning, and what happens next is not predetermined. It is a decision. Because the holes in the net are not permanent features of the universe. They are not laws of physics. They are, as we established, the result of finite resources being allocated by priority, and priorities can change. Every one of those unwatched volcanoes, every Cupranov in waiting out there with no seismometer near it, could, in principle, be brought into the net. It would take money. It would take instruments installed in difficult and remote places. It would take more satellites, more analysts, more international cooperation, more of the patient, unglamorous work of monitoring things that, on most days, do nothing at all. None of that is impossible. None of it requires a scientific breakthrough. It requires only that we decide the listening is worth it, and here is the case for why it is. Every volcano we successfully bring into the net is a volcano transformed from a potential ambush into a manageable risk. Remember what the old way actually was. The old way, the way of every century before ours, was not some state of peaceful coexistence with the planet's volcanoes. It was ignorance, and ignorance that periodically ended in disaster with no warning whatsoever. Communities have been destroyed throughout human history by volcanoes that gave their warnings to no one because no one had the instruments to receive them. The whispers were there. The swarms of small earthquakes, the rising gas, the slow swelling of the ground, all of it was there before those eruptions, exactly as it was there before Cupranov. But there was nothing listening, and so the warning was never heard, and people died who did not have to. That is the alternative to the monitoring net. Not safety, but silence. And when you frame it that way, the value of what we are building becomes obvious. A volcano you can hear waking up is a volcano whose neighbours you can warn, whose airspace you can clear, whose hazards you can prepare for. The net does not stop eruptions. Nothing stops eruptions. They are the planet being the planet. But the net converts an eruption from a catastrophe that arrives out of nowhere into an event that can be anticipated, planned for, and survived. That is the entire difference between the old world and the one we are now, slowly and incompletely building. So let me bring this all the way home, back to where we started, back to that whisper from 12 miles beneath the Alaska Peninsula. We began this video with a fear, the fear that the planet itself is waking up, that the sleeping giants are stirring because something has fundamentally changed in the Earth. And we followed that fear honestly all the way down, and we found that it does not survive contact with the evidence. The three giants are not connected. They woke for three unrelated reasons. Volcanic activity is not measurably increasing. The clustering is the ordinary clumping of chance, and volcanoes have always reactivated in every century, including all the centuries when no one could see it. The planet is not waking up. We are. We are the ones waking up, opening our eyes after a long history of blindness, and finally beginning to see the restless, magnificent, indifferent geological machine we have always lived on top of. The sleeping giants were never really asleep in the sense of being safely inert. They were simply unwatched. And now, increasingly, they are not. And that is not a horror story. That is the single greatest advance in volcanic safety our species has ever achieved. But I will leave you, as this channel always tries to, with the honest thread still hanging, because the story is not finished, and it would be a lie to pretend it is. The net has holes. Tonight, while you have been listening to this, somewhere on this planet, in a place with no seismometer close enough and no satellite analyst happening to look, there is very likely a mountain that the world has written off as dead, and beneath it, 12 or 15 or 20 miles down, in the dark, something has begun to move. A whisper has begun. A sleeping giant has begun the slow, quiet, patient climb toward wakefulness, exactly as Cupranov did, exactly as Hayli Gubbi did, exactly as Krasheninnikov did. It is happening right now. The only thing we do not know, the only thing we genuinely cannot say tonight, is where that mountain is, and whether, when it finally speaks loudly enough for the world to hear, there will be anyone, anything, any instrument at all close enough to have heard the whisper that came first.